$910 billion, that is the number the United States put on the table. And Canada said no, not maybe, not let's renegotiate, not give us time, just no. Within 4 hours, the answer was public, clear, direct, final. And in that single moment, the balance of power in North American energy shifted. Because this was never just about money, it was about control, about leverage, about who actually holds the switch to the lights, the heat, and the fuel that keeps an entire country moving. And when Canada rejected that deal, it sent a message that Washington did not expect to hear. The proposal had a powerful name, the North American Energy Security Compact. It sounded strong, it sounded stable, it sounded like partnership. But when you look closely at what it really was, you see something very different. This was a 6-year energy supply agreement, comprehensive, locked in, massive in scale. The United States wanted guaranteed access to Canadian crude oil, natural gas, electricity, uranium, and critical minerals. Everything that powers an economy. Everything that keeps factories running and homes warm in winter. The value? Roughly $150 billion per year. Over 6 years, that equals $910 billion, the largest bilateral energy deal ever proposed in North America. On the surface, it looked generous, almost historic, but the details tell the real story. The deal would have locked Canada into maintaining current export levels to the United States, about 4 million barrels of crude oil per day, billions of cubic feet of natural gas, steady electricity exports across the border, a stable stream of uranium for American nuclear plants. The message from Washington was simple. We will guarantee that we buy your energy for 6 years. That sounds secure, it sounds like protection, but security for who? The pricing formula was tied to global benchmarks, yes, but always at a discount. Canadian crude would be priced below West Texas Intermediate. Canadian natural gas would be priced below the Henry Hub benchmark. The justification was called a proximity premium. The argument was that Canada should accept lower prices because it saves money by shipping energy to its neighbor instead of across the ocean. In simple terms, the United States was saying, we are close, so you should charge us less. The problem is that global buyers are willing to pay more. Japan, South Korea, Germany, India. These countries are competing for energy supply. They are paying closer to global rates, sometimes even above benchmark prices when supply is tight. So what the deal really said was this: we will guarantee you a customer, but only if you sell to us cheaper than the rest of the world. That is not partnership, that is control. And then came the most important part, the volume lock. For 6 full years, Canada would be required to maintain its export levels to the United States. That clause sounds technical, but it is the heart of the entire story, because Canada has spent billions building new infrastructure that allows it to sell energy west, not just south. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion created Pacific access for crude oil. Tankers can now leave from the coast of British Columbia and head directly to Asia. The LNG Canada terminal in Kitimat allows natural gas to be liquefied and shipped overseas for the first time in Canadian history. For decades, Canada had only one major customer for its energy, the United States. One direction, one pipeline network, one buyer. And when you only have one buyer, that buyer sets the price. But now Canada has options. And the 6-year volume commitment would have stopped Canada from using those options fully. It would have guaranteed that 4 million barrels per day continued flowing south while new Pacific infrastructure sat underused. It would have locked in the old system right at the moment when Canada finally built a new one. Imagine spending billions of dollars building a second door out of your house, then signing a contract that forces you to keep using the first door only. That is what the proposal was asking Canada to do. And it gets even more complicated. The deal focused only on energy. It did not roll back tariffs on Canadian steel. It did not remove tariffs on aluminum. It did not solve trade disputes over lumber, agriculture, or manufacturing. In other words, the United States wanted discounted, guaranteed energy while still taxing other Canadian exports. From Ottawa's point of view, that is not a fair trade. That is selective partnership. Energy is not separate from trade. Energy is trade. It is part of the same relationship. And asking Canada to lock in cheap energy sales while leaving tariffs in place on everything else felt one-sided. Washington may have believed the size of the deal made it impossible to reject. $910 billion sounds overwhelming. It sounds like something no country would turn down. But value is not just about size, it is about terms. And when Canada studied those terms, the conclusion was clear. The pricing was below global market opportunities. The volume lock limited future growth. The trade issues were not resolved. The deal protected American energy security, but it did not protect Canadian leverage. So within 4 hours, the answer came. Canada is not a captive energy supplier. That sentence changed everything. Because the United States did not just offer money. It tried to preserve a system where Canada remained dependent on a single buyer, a system where energy flowed in one direction and pricing power stayed in Washington. But that system only works if the supplier has no alternative, and Canada now has alternatives. That is why the $10 billion offer failed, not because it was too small, not because Canada wanted conflict, but because the world has changed. Canada is no longer a country with one energy customer. It is a country with access to global markets. It has pipelines to the Pacific. It has LNG terminals shipping overseas. It has Asian buyers willing to pay higher prices. It has European nations searching for stable supply. It has the third largest proven oil reserves in the world. And when you control resources at that scale, you do not accept discounted long-term contracts unless the terms truly reflect partnership. The United States believed the size of the check would outweigh the structure of the deal. Canada looked at the structure instead and said no. The rejection was not emotional. It was strategic. It was not loud. It was direct. And in that calm, firm refusal, something very important became clear. The leverage in this relationship may not sit where Washington thought it did. This was the opening move in a much larger shift. And the scramble that followed would prove just how much the United States depends on the energy it tried to lock in. 4 hours. That's how long it took for Canada to answer a $910 billion proposal. Not weeks, not days. 4 hours. When a country rejects the largest energy deal in its history that fast, it means one thing. The decision was already made before the paper hit the desk. Canada's energy minister stepped in front of cameras and said something that echoed far beyond Ottawa. Canada is not a captive energy supplier.
That sentence was not just a response, it was a declaration of independence. For decades, Canada's energy flowed almost entirely in one direction, south. Pipelines connected Alberta to American refineries. Gas pipelines fed American heating systems. Electricity crossed the border into northern U.S. states. The relationship was stable, predictable, and heavily one-sided in structure. The United States was the buyer. Canada was the supplier. And when you have only one main buyer, that buyer usually has the power.
But the moment Canada rejected that deal, it showed that structure no longer exists. The rejection was not emotional, it was calculated, and behind it were 3 clear reasons that explain why Canada felt strong enough to walk away from nearly $1 trillion. The first reason was price. For years, Canadian oil sold at a discount compared to global benchmarks. Western Canadian crude is heavier, thicker, and requires special refining. Because it was mostly landlocked, Canada had limited access to global markets. Without ocean access, it had to accept whatever price its main buyer offered. That buyer was the United States. But that reality has changed. With the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Canadian oil can now reach the Pacific coast. From there, it can be loaded onto tankers and shipped to Asia. And in Asia, oil is often priced against Brent crude, the global benchmark, which regularly trades higher than West Texas Intermediate. That means the same barrel of oil can earn more money overseas than it can inside the United States. The same thing is happening with natural gas. Asian LNG markets often pay higher spot prices than the Henry Hub benchmark in America. Countries like Japan and South Korea are willing to pay premiums to secure stable long-term supply. So when Washington offered a 6-year deal tied to discounted pricing formulas, Canada had to compare that offer to global demand. Why lock in a lower price for 6 years when higher prices are available right now? Energy is a commodity, and commodities flow toward the highest bidder. The second reason was volume control. The proposed agreement required Canada to maintain current export levels to the United States for 6 years. That sounds harmless at first, but in reality, it would have limited Canada's flexibility during a critical growth period. Canada just completed major infrastructure projects. The Trans Mountain expansion dramatically increased the amount of oil that can reach the Pacific coast. LNG Canada and Kitimat opened the door to overseas gas exports for the first time. These projects were not built to keep selling only to America. They were built to create alternatives. Signing a long-term volume lock would have slowed that shift. It would have reduced Canada's ability to expand contracts in Asia and Europe. It would have guaranteed that large portions of Canadian output continued flowing south, even if global demand elsewhere grew faster. No country invests billions in new export routes just to sign away the flexibility those routes provide. Canada built those pipelines for a reason. The third reason was broader trade pressure. At the time of the proposal, tariffs remained in place on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and other products. Energy was being separated from the rest of the trade relationship, but Canada refused to treat energy in isolation. From Ottawa's perspective, you cannot impose tariffs on our industries while asking for guaranteed discounted energy supply. That creates imbalance. If the United States wanted energy security, Canada wanted full trade normalization. Energy was not going to be used as a patch while other disputes remained unresolved. That is why the response was direct and public. It wasn't just about oil. It wasn't just about gas. It was about how the relationship works. And here is where the deeper shift becomes visible. Canada holds 171 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That is the third largest in the world. The United States holds roughly 44.5 billion. That difference matters because reserves represent long-term strength. They represent bargaining power that does not change with election cycles. They represent supply that will exist long after political tensions fade. Geology does not negotiate. When you have nearly 4 times the proven reserves of your largest customer, you do not approach negotiations from weakness. You approach them from confidence. And that confidence was visible in the tone of the rejection. There was no panic, no apology, no hesitation. The statement was calm, controlled, clear. Canada will sell its energy on the global market at competitive prices to willing buyers. That line signaled something important. Canada now sees itself as a global supplier, not a regional one. For decades, Canadian energy policy operated inside a North American framework. One main customer, one main direction, one integrated system. But infrastructure changes strategy. The completion of Pacific export capacity transformed Canada's position. For the first time, it could compare offers from multiple regions and choose the most favorable. That changes everything in negotiations. Because once a supplier has real alternatives, the buyer loses automatic leverage. The United States may have assumed Canada still depended on it for energy revenue. That assumption was based on history, but history is not infrastructure. Pipelines, terminals, ports, shipping contracts, these are physical realities. And those realities now allow Canada to redirect supply if necessary. That is why the rejection came so quickly. Canada did not need to stall. It did not need to calculate emergency alternatives. The alternatives already exist. And the global energy market is watching closely. When a country with the third largest oil reserves in the world publicly refuses a long-term discounted contract from its largest trading partner, it sends a signal. It tells Asia that supply is available. It tells Europe that partnerships are possible. It tells markets that Canadian energy is open for business globally. The rejection was not an act of hostility. It was an act of repositioning. And repositioning in energy markets can take decades to achieve. Canada spent years fighting legal battles to complete the Trans Mountain expansion. It invested public funds when private investors hesitated. It navigated environmental reviews and political pushback. It absorbed delays and cost overruns. Why go through all of that effort just to remain locked into a single buyer system? The rejection answered that question. Canada did not build westward access to remain captive. It built it to gain freedom. And once that freedom existed, the old pricing structure no longer made sense. The speed of the decision revealed confidence. The clarity of the language revealed strategy. And the numbers behind the decision revealed leverage. This was not a country turning down money. It was a country choosing market power over short-term certainty. And when the offer was rejected, the pressure shifted south. Because suddenly, the United States had to confront something it may not have fully accounted for. What happens if Canada truly begins redirecting energy flows? That question is what triggered the scramble. And the scramble reveals who actually needs the deal more.